Hello and welcome to our web chat on effective cash flow forecasting in 6 steps. We are joined by Nicola Christian, founder and managing partner of Cashforce, and we'll be examining how to improve your cash flow forecasting by these 6 steps. These 6 steps seem obvious, but what's going on here? What's important about each of these steps?
Well, Jack, if you look to how we typically try to approach better cash flow forecasting, we look at them as constructing a process that's effective, efficient, and that actually leads us to more accurate cash flow forecasting in actually a shorter amount of time. But what are these 6 steps? So from the top, basically, this first step is understanding working capital drivers. So every company has a different working capital profile. But if you would look to companies or corporates in Southern Europe to Northern Europe, as you can imagine, different payment terms, and they will lead to a total different working capital picture, as well as basically the cash flow forecast looks like. In the second step, we're going to understand the other cash flow drivers within the business. And as you can imagine, every type of business, like manufacturing businesses, retail businesses, they have totally different types of in and out streams. And now in the third step, we're going to look at the cash flow horizons. So what makes sense in terms of constructing a short-term, mid-term, and long-term cash flow forecast? And effectively, the short-term for, let's say, an energy producer, basically an energy retailer, it could mean something totally different than, for example, a do-it-yourself retailer, where the short term is just restricted to just a couple of days, 3-4 days. While basically looking at the energy producer, it could basically be almost a full year, the short.
Is there a difference of attitude in these companies, or do they all think the same way about this?
Well, they don't think the same way. So even though you might be in the same industry, you come across the treasurer, the CFO, and they'll typically project what they think is the short-term forecast for them. And it typically is related to how they are projecting their business going forward. Are they at a growth stage? Are they basically acquiring new businesses? Do they need growth capital? So basically, it really relates to the stage that they are in terms of the growth. Now, relating to the fourth step, basically, it's about defining your cash forecasting sources. So you could basically pick a source like an ERP system, a CRM system where you have a lot of information of the company. But you could also relate to basically other drivers, dividend payouts, salaries, for example, in your payroll system. So there could be different sources all the way in your cash flow forecasting process. And finally, you're going to integrate them to consolidate the data from the different sources in the 5th step. And I think the 6th step is where basically you put the cherry on the cake, is where you apply logics to your forecast. And what does that mean? Is that you make a cash forecast just a bit smarter than just consolidating the data. And what do I mean with this? If you have a known customer payment behavior, you know that certain customers always pay late or always pay at a certain period in a certain period of the month. Basically, you're going to take that into account. So you're making a cash flow forecasting more accurate.
And is that per customer or is it per major customer? How do you do that?
Yeah, so we see when we come across client cases, we see that clients, they don't have always the analytical capability in the systems to basically calculate that on a customer level. Now we do that. Cashforce, we are specifically focused on making it more accurate. And just applying like a general DSO or let's say average payment time to a cash flow pattern is just not accurate enough. So we really will do that on a customer by customer basis, looking at customer payment behavior, maybe also in 2 ways. We're not only looking at how late are they typically paying, but some customers, they just pay when they typically pay, like on the 4th of the month or like the 15th of the month or the second payment run of the month. So we're going to take that into account. So it goes quite deep.
Now these six steps are really quite logical and what I would expect. But what's the most painful step in here? What's the thing that causes the most trouble?
Well, I think you can talk hours about each step, but the step that for us and that we see quite often is something that corporates won't admit themselves. But if you really deep dive into the nitty-gritty stuff of cash flow forecasting, it's the fifth step. It's basically integrating, consolidating the data that causes most of the headaches as well as most of the painful processing.
And this is what we're going to look at in the next slide. So why is this a problem?
Well, if you look at the first part of integrating and consolidating data, it's about how do you organize that each subsidiary basically will give you the right information at the right time to the right person. And if you compare left with right, basically it's left how we see, I would say 80% of the corporates doing today, and on the right-hand side, how we think it should be done. And on the left-hand side, what you'll see is a manual follow-up process. What does it mean? The headquarter typically will request on a specific, based on a specific calendar from each subsidiary to post or to submit their forecast in a certain format, let's say encompassing a certain region, and just sending that over via email to the headquarter, or maybe just a little bit more automated by a certain system. Now, while that actually is in itself a good process, it's typically done manual, which requires the treasurer sitting at headquarters to basically send reminders to people. And of these 60 entities, you'll typically have already 2 or 3 persons that are sick or on leave. They're not there. So they are either too late or they're too early so that their cash forecast isn't actually any accurate at all. So what we think is going to a more automated workflow. What we did at Cashflow is we installed the system in such a way that there is a calendar that is generating alerts for local treasurers, which they actually need to react upon and to send the information at the right time with the right format and in the right accuracy to the headquarter in a really workflow-based process.
Does this include the extraction of ERP details as well?
Exactly, and I think you're touching the right point, which is presented on the next slide. This is interesting to know how it works from a workflow perspective, just like a business process. But I think if you really go down to what's most painful, really most painful of this process, it's about the system integration and how systems talk to one another. And I think I made the comparison the same, is left is how the classical way of doing this with your classical TMS system looks like. And on the right-hand side, how we advise as Cashflow to install such a process. And on the left-hand side, just to explain what's on there, you're basically consolidating at the headquarter information that's being manually extracted first by the local treasurer from the ERP. It's downloaded. You can all imagine the situation where you download from SAP what you need. Then you do additions to that data in Excel. And that Excel file is then uploaded to a platform where it's being consolidated. Now, in the left situation, you basically see there is a manual process behind, which is literally fully manual. And the second thing, which is very important, is you don't have an audit trail. So one of the 60 treasurers, local treasurers, might have changed something to whatever they extracted from the ERP. But as a headquarter treasurer, you don't know what actually has happened. And this is where we think the biggest flaw is. If you make a forecast, you only make a forecast to compare it later on with your actuals and say, well, how can we improve? So you need to know where your difference, where your variance is. And this comes actually on top. This actually comes much more to the forefront in the right picture, the picture on the right-hand side. So what do we do with Cashflow? We basically make an automated link between the ERP and the output that the local treasurer sees. He can make additions, but any of these additions has an audit trail. So whatever the local treasurer changes, he sees exactly, I changed this at this moment in time, and I changed this number to this number. And the second part to it is that if you make sure that your local treasurer already has like a pre-filled sheet of information inside a platform, he then only will need to amend 10, 15% of the data which is manual or which is driven by something he only knows. And when that is being consolidated, with Cashforce and submit it to the headquarter, both for headquarter and both for the local treasurer, it's immediately very transparent what has been extracted from a system perspective and what has been amended by the local treasurer.
How does the local treasury people react to this?
That's actually a very good question. I think from a headquarter perspective, you can imagine that they're all, let's say, in favor because they have more transparency. They can look over the shoulder of the local treasurer. Now, from the local treasury perspective, it's basically giving them now less work to do because it's more automated. It flows right into their hands. But the second thing is they're conscious that whatever they change makes a bit of sense. So it is basically a two-way street between the headquarter treasurer and the local treasurer, while before that was actually just a one-way street. You just give the information and you hope that the group treasurer is not going to call you. Now, in the second process, you can actually work hand in hand and make sure that both the interests of the local and the headquarter treasury are aligned.
How do you incorporate the reviews of cash flow accuracy and the strategic importance of the different numbers? Because these debates, and participated in a couple, and they're really quite painful, yet are incredibly important. So where does Cashforce fit in this?
Right. Well, to be starting with this, when we have this type of discussions, it's sometimes interesting to see that like the accuracy percentage, just the definition, the KPI itself, it's a KPI which can be calculated in hundreds of different ways. Some people do an accuracy per plant, maybe they just do it on group level, they do it per category. So that debate on itself, in my personal opinion, is something that will be much more elaborated on in the coming years, but because people now still focus, as I said in this presentation, they still focus on the process, just how things are done. But the next step is all about analyzing if you're accurate. If you're accurate? If you're not accurate, what's the reason? Where exactly can you improve? And essentially, if I am accurate, how am I actually taking this accuracy with me and actually improve the cash generation of the business?
So your conclusion is summed up by this slide here. Can you explain?
Yeah, so as I said, the focus today for a lot of the group treasurers and local treasurers is still on how do I get this accurate? How do I get this an efficient process? And the straight answer is, if you think about all the bottlenecks in the process, just like you're looking at a supply chain in a factory, it just needs to be well thought out how you construct a process, removing the bottlenecks, automating as much as possible. And as you know, if you have the process right, you can start analyzing the output, you can improve the process. But if you haven't got the process in line, it's just fighting with different bottlenecks, and you never get to see the real output, or you don't pay even attention to it because the process is that painful. So focus on the process, get it right, and then you'll get the output. You'll get much more time to look at the output and analyze.
Well, thank you very much. That was most interesting and useful as always.
Thanks a lot, Jack.